It was just another ordinary afternoon in the sleepy little town of Cedar Ridge. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet streets and the little diner where the locals came to take a break from their busy lives. The small town, nestled in the hills, wasn't known for much. People rarely passed through, and the steady hum of life seemed to slow down as the hours passed by. In Cedar Ridge, everyone knew each other. They waved at one another on the sidewalks, exchanged pleasantries, and shared meals at the diner with familiar faces. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. And on this particular afternoon, the diner was as peaceful as it had always been. The clink of silverware, the soft buzz of conversation, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. No one could have known that, in this very place, something unforgettable was about to unfold. At the far end of the diner, sitting alone in a corner booth by the window, was Jack Dawson. He didn't stand out at first glance. Just another middle-aged man enjoying his lunch, sipping on a cup of coffee as the world around him went on. But there was something about the way he sat calm, still, almost as though he was waiting for something, but not in a way that made him seem anxious or restless. Jack had learned long ago that some things were worth waiting for. And he'd learned, perhaps even more importantly, that sometimes, you don't go looking for trouble. Trouble finds you. The regulars knew Jack, though they didn't know him all that well. He wasn't the type to share his life story with anyone, and people tended to respect that. He was just the quiet guy in the corner, the one who didn't ask for attention. He'd been coming to the diner for months now, sitting in the same spot, reading the newspaper, or simply staring out the window as if lost in thought. To the townspeople, Jack was a bit of a mystery. No one knew exactly where he'd come from or why he'd ended up in Cedar Ridge, but that didn't stop them from offering him a smile when they saw him. Jack didn't mind. He wasn't much for small talk. He liked it that way. On the surface, Jack Dawson seemed like any other man. His hair was graying at the edges, and his face was weathered, as though life had worn him down in ways few could understand. His clothes were simple: a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and a pair of boots that had seen better days. He carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, but also with a certain humility that made him blend into the background. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He didn't need anyone to see him. Not anymore. But there was something more to Jack. Beneath the surface, beneath the calm exterior, was a man who had lived a life few could even imagine. A life of danger, of challenges that had pushed him to his limits and beyond. A life that had been anything but ordinary. He was a retired Navy SEAL, a veteran of countless missions, some of which he couldn't, and perhaps wouldn't, ever talk about. His time in the military had left its mark on him physically and mentally. His hands were calloused, his back ached from years of hard work and combat. But it wasn't just his body that had been shaped by his past, it was his mind, too. Jack had seen things most people couldn't even fathom. He had done things he'd never wish on anyone. He'd been to the darkest corners of the world, and he had returned with the scars to prove it. Yet, when he sat in that diner, sipping his coffee and staring out the window, he looked like any other regular guy. The townspeople had no idea who Jack really was. To them, he was just another quiet man who liked his space. They didn't know that the man sitting at that booth had once lived a life full of danger and risk. They didn't know the kinds of battles Jack had fought, the enemies he'd faced, or the deep sacrifices he had made for his country. But Jack wasn't interested in talking about that. The war was over for him. He had left that life behind, retired from active duty, and settled into the slow-paced life of Cedar Ridge. He didn't need to be a hero anymore. He just wanted peace. The truth was, Jack had spent most of his time trying to forget the past, trying to bury the memories of the missions that haunted him. The memories of his comrades, some of whom had never made it home. Those were the things that kept him up at night, the things that followed him even in the quietest moments. But there, in Cedar Ridge, in the corner of that little diner, Jack felt like he could breathe. For the first time in a long while, he could let the weight of the world fall off his shoulders, even if just for a little while. But as Jack sat there, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by, something in the air began to change. The quiet hum of the diner, the clinking of silverware, and the soft chatter of the regulars started to feel different. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the energy of the room, but Jack could feel it. He wasn't sure what it was, but his instincts, honed over years of military service, told him something was off. He wasn't sure what, but he knew trouble was coming. Then, the door to the diner opened, and in walked a group of bikers. Jack didn't need to look up to know they were trouble. You could tell by the way they walked, by the way their heavy boots hit the floor with each step. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scruffy beard and a skull tattoo on his neck, scanned the room with a sharp, challenging look. His eyes darted from one table to the next, sizing up the people around him, looking for anyone who might be an easy target. The bikers had that air about them. They weren't here to enjoy a peaceful meal. They were here for attention. They were here to make a statement. And as they approached the counter, laughing loudly and pushing past people, the entire atmosphere of the diner shifted. The clatter of silverware seemed louder. The conversations grew quieter. The air became thick with tension. The leader of the group spotted Jack sitting in his corner booth. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply continued sipping his coffee, his eyes still focused out the window. But the biker wasn't so easily ignored. With a slow, deliberate motion, he began walking toward Jack's booth, his boots thudding heavily against the floor with each step. Jack could feel the eyes of the diner on him. He wasn't the kind of man who would draw attention to himself, but now, it seemed, attention was coming his way whether he liked it or not. When the biker reached Jack's booth, he stopped, staring down at him with a mocking grin. "You sit in here all by yourself," the biker sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "This your spot, old man." Jack didn't look up at him. He didn't even move. He just took another sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch between them. The biker took this as a challenge, leaning in closer, his breath hot and sour on Jack's face. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the biker growled. "You think you own this place?" For a moment, the only sound in the diner was the scraping of silverware as the other patrons tried to pretend they weren't watching. But Jack didn't care. He had been through far worse than this. Far worse than some arrogant biker trying to provoke him. Jack knew how to handle situations like this. He'd done it 1,000 times before. But that didn't mean he was in a hurry to do it again. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to prove anything. He just wanted to be left alone. But the universe didn't always give you what you wanted. And sometimes, when you least expected it, life would send you a reminder of who you really were and what you were capable of. Jack Dawson was about to find out just how true that was. It was the silence that made the whole situation more intense. Everyone in the diner seemed to hold their breath, watching the scene unfold as the biker stood there, towering over Jack's booth. It was almost as if time had slowed down, the seconds stretching out in a way that made every small movement feel significant. The clinking of silverware, the low murmurs from the other tables, it all faded away into the background, as though everything had been put on pause. Jack didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't give any sign that the biker's words had any effect on him. His fingers still gripped his coffee mug, his eyes still looked out the window as though the man wasn't even there. And yet, the tension was palpable. The biker, standing over him with his arms crossed, was starting to realize that Jack wasn't going to react the way he expected. Most people would have been intimidated, would have shrunk back in fear or tried to apologize to avoid conflict. But not Jack. The biker's grin faltered just slightly, and Jack could see the hesitation in his eyes. The man had been used to bullying people, pushing them around, making them feel small, but Jack wasn't like everyone else. And for a moment, the biker wasn't sure what to do with that. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. With a sudden, aggressive motion, the biker slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. "I said, you gonna move or what?" His voice was louder now, harsh and challenging. But Jack still didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just took another sip of his coffee, his expression as calm as ever. For a moment, the biker's anger seemed to boil over, and he leaned in closer, pushing the boundaries, trying to provoke Jack. "What, you too old to move, old man? You too scared?" He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the diner. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared to speak up. They were used to the bikers coming into the diner. Some of them had been around here long enough to know the trouble they brought with them. But no one had ever seen someone like Jack. There was something about him that made people hesitate. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, the way he didn't seem to care about the noise or the tension in the air. Or maybe it was something more. For a moment, it seemed like Jack was about to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he set his coffee mug down slowly, carefully, on the table. The soft clink of porcelain hitting porcelain was the only sound in the room, and in that moment, it felt louder than any of the biker's taunts. Jack's fingers lingered on the handle of the mug, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and calm. "You're not in the right place for this," he said, his tone almost gentle. But the words carried weight. "You think you can walk in here and start trouble without consequences?" The biker took a step back, his smirk fading just a bit. He hadn't expected Jack to speak, and definitely hadn't expected his words to sound so unbothered. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the biker's eyes. But he quickly pushed it aside, trying to regain control of the situation. "Consequences," the biker scoffed, stepping even closer, towering over Jack's booth. "What are you gonna do about it? You think you're tough just 'cause you're sittin' here, drinking coffee? You're nothing. Just an old man who got lucky." Jack finally looked up. His gaze was calm, but there was something in it that made the biker pause. It wasn't fear, but something else, a quiet power, a silent strength that made the biker feel like he was the one being judged. And that's when it hit him. This man wasn't just anyone. The air in the diner seemed to grow heavier. Jack's posture was relaxed, but there was an undeniable intensity in the way he carried himself. His eyes, those eyes, dark and steady, were no longer just staring out the window. They were focused, and in that moment, the biker realized that he had made a mistake. A huge mistake. Jack Dawson wasn't just an ordinary man. He wasn't a nobody. But the biker wasn't going to back down. No, he had too much pride. He had to prove something, had to show that he was the one in control here. He had spent his whole life demanding respect from others, making sure that people knew he was the one to be feared. He wasn't about to let some quiet guy in a diner make him feel small. So, the biker leaned in even closer, his face inches from Jack's. "You think you can stop me?" he growled. "You think you can take me on? You're not even worth my time." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He didn't make a big scene. He just sat there, his expression calm, almost too calm. But inside, something was stirring. The years of training, the endless drills, the missions that had brought him face to face with danger more times than he could count, they were all coming to the surface now. Jack Dawson was not the man that this biker thought he was. And that was about to become painfully clear. There was a moment of silence, a brief lull in the tension, before the biker took another step forward, thinking he had won. He raised his hand, as if to slap Jack, to remind him who was in charge. But just as his hand moved, Jack's reaction was lightning fast. In one smooth motion, he reached up, grabbed the biker's wrist, and twisted it with a force that made the man gasp. The biker tried to pull away, but Jack held him firm, his grip unyielding. The other bikers in the diner froze. No one had expected that. "You really should have thought this through," Jack said, his voice still steady, not even a hint of anger in it. The biker's face turned red with frustration, but he couldn't break free. Jack wasn't just holding him, he was controlling him. The biker's muscles strained against Jack's grip, but it was no use. Jack was in control now. Jack's eyes remained focused on the biker, his expression unwavering. "I told you. This is the wrong place for this. And you're the wrong person to mess with." With one swift motion, Jack pushed the biker back, sending him stumbling into the chairs at the next table. The man collided with them with a loud crash, and for a moment, everything in the diner went silent. The bikers stared at Jack, shocked and unsure of what to do next. They had never expected someone like him. The old man in the corner had just put them in their place without raising his voice or breaking a sweat. The leader of the group, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, now took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. But there was something in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Fear. Respect. Maybe both. He hadn't counted on Jack being so capable. And now, he was starting to realize just how out of his depth he was. Jack didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The message was clear. He wasn't the kind of man who tolerated disrespect, especially not from people who thought they could intimidate others just because they were bigger, louder, or tougher. The bikers stood in a tense, uncomfortable silence, looking at each other, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't expected to meet resistance like this. Not in a small diner like this. Not from a man who seemed so ordinary. They had thought they could have their fun, make a scene, and leave without consequences. But now, they were learning a valuable lesson. You can't always get away with pushing people around, especially when you're dealing with someone who's been through more than you can imagine. Finally, the biker who had first confronted Jack stepped back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. His pride had been wounded, and he wasn't sure how to recover from it. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to challenge Jack again. "Let's go," the leader of the group muttered, his voice low, almost apologetic. "We're leaving." And just like that, the bikers turned and walked out of the diner, their heads hung low, their swagger gone. The tension in the room slowly started to dissipate, but Jack didn't move. He just sat there, calm and collected, as if nothing had happened. And for him, it was as simple as that. The people in the diner stared at Jack, some in awe, others in disbelief. They had all witnessed something extraordinary, but none of them knew just who Jack Dawson really was or how close they had come to seeing something they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. But Jack didn't care. The lesson had been learned, and that was all that mattered. The heavy wooden door of the diner swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the room, as though announcing the arrival of something unwelcome. The sound of chatter and the clinking of silverware came to an abrupt halt as a group of bikers swaggered in. Leather jackets, bandanas, and tattoos decorated their bodies, all of them walking with a confidence that screamed trouble. Their boots thudded loudly against the floor as they moved toward the counter, each step making their presence known. They didn't have to say a word. The way they carried themselves spoke volumes. The air in the diner shifted, turning thick with tension. The regulars, familiar with these types, exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. They had seen this act before, bikers coming in, loud and brash, demanding attention. Sometimes they were just passing through, sometimes looking for a fight, and other times just wanting to make their mark in any way they could. Either way, trouble followed them like a shadow. But today, something felt different. The usual unease was laced with a quiet anxiety. They weren't sure if it was just the presence of the bikers or something else. Something that didn't belong here. But Jack didn't seem to notice. He just continued sitting in his booth, sipping his coffee as though he were unaware of the attention they were gathering. He'd been in worse situations. He had seen it all: hostile crowds, aggressive enemies, and situations where the stakes were higher than a scuffle in a diner. He had trained for this kind of tension, had been in more than enough dangerous encounters to know how to handle it. He was calm, collected, and ready for whatever came his way. The bikers could strut around all they wanted, but Jack wasn't interested in getting involved unless he had to. He had long since learned to pick his battles. But then, it happened. One of the bikers, a tall man with a prominent skull tattoo on his neck, spotted Jack sitting in his corner booth. The biker's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the older man, sitting there so calm, so composed. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong in a diner full of rough, loud bikers. For a moment, the biker's gaze lingered on Jack's face, scanning it for any sign of weakness or fear. But Jack's expression remained unchanged. The biker's smirk grew wider as he took a step closer, clearly intent on making his mark. "Hey, old man," the biker called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is our spot," he sneered, pointing directly at Jack's booth with an exaggerated gesture. "You gonna move, or what?" The other bikers behind him laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the diner. They circled the table next to Jack's, crowding into the small space with their loud chatter and rough laughter, clearly expecting Jack to back down. The rest of the diner's patrons shrank into their seats, trying to pretend they weren't witnesses to what was unfolding. They had seen this before. Bikers came in, acted tough, and made people uncomfortable. But usually, someone stood up to them, tried to keep the peace. This time, though, there was something different in the air. A feeling that something was about to go down, and no one was quite sure how it was going to end. Jack didn't move, didn't even look up from his coffee. He wasn't startled, nor did he feel the need to respond. He'd spent years in places where confrontation was an everyday occurrence. He'd lived through things most people couldn't imagine, things that would make even the toughest men think twice. This group of bikers? They were a walk in the park compared to some of the things Jack had faced. But that didn't mean he was ready to let them walk all over him. The biker, now standing right over Jack's booth, crossed his arms and leaned down closer, his face inches from Jack's. "What's the matter, old man?" he taunted. "You deaf or just too scared to talk? I told you this is our spot." The other bikers laughed louder, egging the man on, enjoying the sight of the tension rising. They had been used to intimidating people, taking control of any space they walked into. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jack hadn't even moved a muscle. His calm demeanor, in a place like this, had a quiet intensity to it that made the bikers pause, just for a second. They thought it was just the typical old guy in the corner, minding his business, too weak to stand up to them. But what they didn't realize was that Jack Dawson was no ordinary man. He wasn't someone you could bully or push around. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, the quiet motion almost seeming defiant in the face of the biker's aggression. His eyes never left the window, but something shifted within him. He could feel the anger in the biker's words, the arrogance in the way they carried themselves. It wasn't just about the space at the booth. No, it was something deeper. Something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a while. Jack had been underestimated for most of his life. People looked at him, saw an old man with gray hair and a quiet, unassuming demeanor, and thought they could walk all over him. It wasn't just these bikers. He had dealt with people who thought they could push him around in the past. They didn't know about the life he had lived, the things he had done. They didn't know that he had been a Navy SEAL, that he had faced danger in places most people never even heard of. He had fought for his life, for survival, countless times. But now, in his retirement, he had learned to stay out of trouble. To stay in the background. It wasn't worth the fight anymore. But something about these bikers rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way they spoke, as if they owned the world. Maybe it was the way they assumed everyone else was beneath them. Or maybe it was just the fact that he had seen enough arrogance and disrespect in his life to know that it wasn't worth letting slide. The biker waited for Jack to respond, his grin wide and full of mockery. He was expecting Jack to apologize, to back down, to move out of the booth and make space for them. That was the usual game. He had done it hundreds of times before. But Jack didn't play the same game. Finally, Jack set his coffee cup down with deliberate slowness. The sound of the porcelain against the table was the only noise that broke the tension in the air. His eyes, which had been fixed on the window just moments before, shifted slowly to meet the biker's. And in that glance, the biker felt something. Something that made him hesitate, just for a moment. Jack's voice, when it came, was steady, calm. It didn't rise in anger. It wasn't loud. It was simple. "You want this spot?" Jack asked, his words measured and controlled. "Then you're gonna have to take it from me." The biker blinked, taken aback by the unexpected response. It wasn't the kind of reaction he was used to. The man wasn't shaking, wasn't begging, wasn't apologizing. He was just calm. It was unsettling. The other bikers around the table seemed to sense the shift too. They had expected an easy target, someone to push around, someone to laugh at. But now they were starting to see that maybe this old man wasn't as easy as they thought. For a brief moment, the diner was absolutely still. No one moved. Even the loudest biker seemed to be thinking, processing the change in the air. The challenge had been made. And now, the question was, what would they do with it? The tall biker with the skull tattoo sneered, still trying to hold on to his bravado. "You think you can stop us? You're just an old man. You're nothing." He shoved a chair aside, walking right up to Jack, his chest puffed out as he glared down at him. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now, something he hadn't expected to see when he first walked in. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch. His calmness only made the biker more unsettled. "You're making a mistake," Jack said quietly, his words simple but carrying weight. "I don't want trouble. But I won't back down either." The biker opened his mouth, about to retort, but then stopped. For a brief moment, the power shifted. Jack's calm presence had thrown him off balance. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. The biker stood there, mouth open, trying to find the words to respond. But Jack's quiet confidence, his steady gaze, seemed to stop him in his tracks. For a second, the biker's bravado wavered. He had been ready to push this old man out of the booth, to show everyone in the diner who was in charge. But now, something was off. This man wasn't backing down. The tension in the air grew thicker, the diner suddenly feeling too small for the confrontation unfolding. Jack didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, calm, unbothered, as if the whole world around him had slowed down to a crawl. The other bikers, sensing the shift, glanced between each other, unsure of how to react. They had been ready to get what they wanted, but now, they weren't so sure. The biker with the skull tattoo finally let out a short, frustrated laugh, shaking his head. "All right, old man," he muttered, backing away a step. "You want to play it like that?" He looked to his gang, who all nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of confusion and simmering anger. Jack's gaze never left the biker. He had seen this kind of dance before, people pushing, testing, trying to find a way to provoke a reaction. But Jack wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He wasn't here to make a scene. He just wanted his coffee and peace. But if they insisted on challenging him, he wouldn't back down. The biker with the skull tattoo sneered and walked away, but the others didn't let up. One of them, a younger man with a messy beard, came up to Jack's table, leaning over it with a cocky grin. His voice dropped to a taunting whisper, but his words still carried. "You should just move, man. It's not worth it. We could have a good time, but you're making it hard on yourself." Jack remained quiet, his hand resting on the edge of the table. The younger biker looked him over, eyes scanning his features, trying to find something to exploit, some weakness to latch onto. Jack felt the man's gaze, but he didn't budge. The man wasn't the one he needed to worry about anyway. The older biker, the one with the skull tattoo, was circling back now, his anger bubbling up again. He couldn't understand why Jack wasn't afraid. The old man should have been shaking in his boots by now, should have been begging them not to hurt him. But Jack was the opposite of what they had expected. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved them. It was the fact that this quiet, calm old man wasn't showing fear. The biker with the skull tattoo came back into view and put his hands on his hips, standing tall, trying to reclaim control. He puffed his chest out, trying to appear even more intimidating, though it was clear now that something in the air had changed. The challenge Jack had presented had shaken the biker, and now, all his words felt like empty threats. "You think this is funny?" The biker sneered, but Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. "It's not about funny," Jack said simply, his voice calm but firm. "It's about respect. You think you can come in here and push people around? Well, you're wrong. No one's going to back down just because you make a scene. You don't own this place. And you sure as hell don't own me." The words hit the biker like a punch, even though Jack hadn't raised his voice. The gang around him shuffled uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This wasn't how they were used to things going. Usually, a couple of harsh words were all it took to get people to move out of the way. But Jack wasn't giving them that. He wasn't just some regular old man who could be intimidated. There was something behind his eyes, something that made them all pause. The biker's fists clenched, but he was still hesitant. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled. "We could take care of you, old man. You're not as tough as you think." Jack stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if giving them every chance to back off. He wasn't a large man, but there was something about the way he carried himself, a certain stillness that seemed to exude power. He had been through enough in his life to know when it was time to fight and when it was time to let the words speak for themselves. He took a deep breath, standing to face the biker, and in that moment, the tension in the diner grew even more intense. It was like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Jack fight back? Would the bikers back down? Jack didn't move a muscle as the biker approached, the anger still seeping from his every movement. The older man locked eyes with him, not saying a word, just standing firm in the face of the growing hostility. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the biker spoke again, his voice low and threatening. "I warned you, old man. You've got one more chance to get out of the way. I'm done asking nicely." But Jack wasn't done. He was done being underestimated, done with people trying to push him around. The calm in his voice remained, but there was an edge to it now. "You don't tell me what to do. And I don't take kindly to threats." The bikers were no longer laughing. The smirks had faded, replaced by a deeper unease. They were used to dominating people, but Jack wasn't like the others. He wasn't scared. And more importantly, he wasn't giving in. "Now," Jack continued, "if you've got something else to say, say it. Otherwise, sit down and leave me be." The words hung in the air for a moment. The biker seemed to hesitate. For a split second, he thought about throwing a punch. But Jack's calm stare held him back. He could feel it in his gut, this wasn't a fight he was sure he wanted. Not anymore. The biker turned to look at his friends, who were starting to exchange uncertain glances of their own. This wasn't the usual confrontation. They had expected to walk in, take over, and leave without so much as a second thought. But Jack had thrown them off balance. There was something about the man that made it clear he wasn't someone to mess with. For a long moment, no one spoke. The diner was so quiet that it felt as if the world outside had stopped. Finally, the tall biker with the skull tattoo snorted and stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with disgust. "We don't have time for this. Let's go, boys." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, the other bikers following him in a huff, clearly not pleased with how things had gone. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room seemed to melt away. The regulars, who had been holding their breath the whole time, let out a collective sigh of relief. No one said anything, but the air had definitely changed. Jack had won. Jack didn't sit back down right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the now empty doorway. Then, slowly, he returned to his booth, picking up his coffee and taking another sip as if nothing had happened. The rest of the diner resumed their meal, albeit a little quieter than before. No one spoke about the incident directly, but it was clear that they had all witnessed something that would linger in their minds for a long time. They had just seen a man stand his ground, a man who wasn't afraid to show that even the quietest person in the room could be the most dangerous when pushed too far. Jack didn't need to make a scene. He didn't need to prove anything. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. And in that moment, the people in the diner, those who had seen what happened, understood something profound. Respect wasn't something you demanded by force. It was something you earned. The bikers, full of their usual bravado, threw their weight around as they plopped down at the nearby tables. The sound of heavy boots thumping against the floor echoed through the diner. They were loud, drawing unwanted attention with their crude jokes and the clinking of beer bottles. One of them, a larger man with a scruffy beard, slapped the counter loudly and let out a raucous laugh, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Hey, what's this place?" "A church," he bellowed, his eyes scanning the room like a predator looking for a target. "Where's the fun in here? Too quiet. Someone make some noise." The group roared with laughter, and the other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jack, however, remained unmoved. He wasn't just ignoring the noise. He was studying them, quietly assessing the group's dynamics. He knew people like them, the kind who sought to control the room, to be the loudest voices in the crowd. What they didn't know was that Jack wasn't intimidated by noise. He didn't care about their words. What mattered to him were their actions. And every careless gesture, every boastful laugh, revealed more about them than they realized. The youngest of the group, a skinny guy with a fresh tattoo of a snake on his forearm, looked Jack's way, his eyes narrowing. "You got a problem with us, old man," he said, a cocky grin spreading across his face. His friends chuckled, egging him on. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a response, though his fingers, resting lightly on the edge of his coffee cup, tightened ever so slightly. The young biker didn't take the silence well. He leaned in a little closer, his voice growing louder. "You hear me, Grandpa?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everyone was holding their breath. The room, once filled with the noise of careless chatter, now felt too still. But Jack still didn't react. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the surface of the mug. The tension between them was palpable, yet Jack's calmness only served to stir the bikers further. They were used to getting reactions. They were used to people squirming when they raised their voices. But Jack wasn't like the others. And his silence only made them more uncomfortable. As the minutes passed, the bikers continued to make noise, acting out more for the attention they were so clearly craving. But Jack didn't care about their taunts or their laughter. He had seen much worse in his time, and he wasn't about to let them get under his skin. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was working, his thoughts moving like a chess player contemplating his next move. He observed how the bikers were acting loud, boastful, and completely unaware of their surroundings. It was obvious that they were more focused on showing off than on being aware of who else was in the diner. Their careless behavior made them predictable, and predictability was something Jack could use. Jack's years of experience, both as a Navy SEAL and in life, had taught him to read people. Every little detail mattered: the way someone moved, the way they spoke, the way they held themselves. And these bikers? They were making the classic mistake of underestimating him, of thinking he was just another old man who would back down when confronted. But Jack had no intention of backing down. Not now, and certainly not when they had crossed a line. The bikers continued to make their crude comments, loud enough for everyone to hear, but Jack's mind wasn't on their words anymore. His focus shifted to their behavior. They were still sitting too close to him, too caught up in their bravado to notice that they had crossed a line of respect. They were looking for trouble, but what they didn't know was that they had already found it. One of the bikers, an older man with a large tattoo of a dragon covering his entire forearm, stood up suddenly, making a grand show of stretching. He stretched his arms above his head, as though trying to assert his dominance in the room. The others watched him, laughing, but Jack caught the small movement in the older biker's hands as he stretched. It was subtle, so subtle that most people would have missed it, but Jack's sharp eyes caught it immediately. The biker was adjusting his jacket, shifting it to reveal a small knife tucked into the waistband. The revelation was enough to make Jack's muscles tighten ever so slightly. He had seen knives before, had faced armed enemies in far worse conditions. A knife wasn't a threat, it was just another tool. But it was still important to note, especially in a situation like this. Jack didn't move. He didn't want to give away that he had seen it. That would be a mistake. Instead, he focused on his coffee, on the calmness of the situation. His hand, still resting on the edge of the table, was steady. His mind was calm, despite the tension growing around him. Jack knew that the bikers were testing him, but what they didn't know was that they were playing into his hands. The young biker with the snake tattoo leaned forward again, his grin widening. "You look like you've seen it all, old man. What's your story?" He was taunting now, trying to provoke Jack into giving him some kind of reaction. But Jack's eyes remained locked on his coffee, unblinking, unfazed. The other bikers, sensing the opportunity to rile him up, joined in. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard, leaned in close and said, "You a vet or something? I bet you fought in some war, huh? You've seen some real action, right?" The words were sharp, digging into Jack's past, trying to get a rise out of him. Jack's hand tightened on his cup, but he didn't say a word. The bikers weren't done yet, though. They needed him to react. But Jack knew the game they were playing, and he refused to give in to their childish provocation. The air between them felt charged now, like a wire ready to snap. The bikers weren't going to back off, not without a reaction. But Jack remained composed. Every move they made, every comment they threw at him, was just another piece of the puzzle he was putting together. He was playing the long game. He had already figured out their plan. The bikers were trying to get him angry, trying to get him to make a mistake. They wanted him to lose control, to start something that would give them the excuse they needed to escalate. They wanted to be the ones in charge, the ones who could push around the old man sitting alone in the corner booth. But Jack had learned over the years that losing control was the quickest way to lose a fight. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he continued to watch, continued to observe, and continued to wait. The bikers were getting restless. They could sense the shift in the air. Their plan wasn't working. Jack wasn't responding the way they expected. But they were too proud, too loud to realize they were losing control of the situation. Jack took another sip of his coffee, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. It was the calm before the storm. And the bikers had no idea what was coming. The tension in the diner was now thick enough to cut with a knife, yet Jack remained a picture of calm. The bikers, on the other hand, were beginning to show signs of frustration. They had underestimated him at first, thinking they could easily push him around. But Jack wasn't giving them the reaction they were hoping for, and the silence between them began to feel heavier. One of the younger bikers, a scruffy guy with a piercing in his eyebrow, leaned back in his chair and glared at Jack, as though daring him to make the first move. The others, sensing a change in the dynamic, started to quiet down, their eyes flicking between Jack and one another. They were trying to figure out what had changed. Why wasn't he scared? Why wasn't he reacting? The young man with the piercing leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, almost like a hiss. You think you're tough, huh? Just because you've got a little age on you, doesn't mean you can scare us off. His words were laced with venom, as if trying to make Jack feel small, trying to provoke a response. But Jack didn't bite. He didn't even flinch. The silence stretched out longer, until it became almost unbearable for the bikers. The rest of the patrons in the diner remained still, as if afraid to even look up. They had all seen the bikers make their entrance, and they had all heard the taunts. But they were waiting, too. They were waiting for something to happen, for something to break the tension. Jack's calmness only seemed to make the situation more unpredictable. Jack's fingers rested lightly on the edge of his coffee cup, his hand still steady, though his mind was racing. He knew how this would go if it kept up. Sooner or later, one of the bikers would snap. One of them would make a move, whether it was a shove, a punch, or something worse. It was inevitable. But Jack also knew that when they did, he had to be ready. He had to be faster than they were, sharper than they were. And so, he waited. He watched. He listened. He let the tension grow, knowing that the longer it stretched, the more likely it was that one of them would make a mistake. That's how people were, after all. They didn't have the patience to wait for the perfect opportunity. They just reacted, and when they did, they revealed their weaknesses. Sure enough, the young man with the piercing couldn't hold his composure any longer. He slammed his fist down onto the table, making the silverware rattle and the other bikers jump. Enough with the staring, old man, he shouted, his voice laced with aggression. You wanna go, huh? You think you can take all of us? The diner seemed to collectively inhale, everyone holding their breath. Jack didn't move, not at first. He let the challenge hang in the air. He knew this wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. But his mind was already processing everything, every possible move, every possible reaction. The young biker's face twisted in frustration as he waited for Jack to make his move. He was looking for something, anything that would give him an advantage. He didn't expect the calm, calculated response that was about to come. With a slow, deliberate movement, Jack set his coffee cup down on the table. His fingers lingered for a moment on the ceramic surface, just enough time to show the biker that Jack was still in control. His gaze lifted to meet the young man's eyes, and for the first time, he spoke. You really don't want to do this, kid, Jack said, his voice low but clear. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. It was the voice of experience, of someone who had seen it all and knew exactly how these situations unfolded. The young biker hesitated. It wasn't the response he expected. In fact, it wasn't any response he had anticipated. He had thought he would scare Jack into some kind of action, something impulsive. Instead, Jack's calmness was unsettling. You hear that, "Boys," the young biker barked, turning back to his friends, trying to regain some of his bravado. "This old man thinks he's got it all figured out. He's acting like he's done something. You think we care?" The other bikers laughed, but the laughter didn't sound as confident anymore. Jack could see the doubt beginning to spread through the group. They weren't used to being questioned. They weren't used to being ignored. And now, they were second-guessing their own bravado. The larger man with the scruffy beard, who had been quiet up until now, stood up slowly from his seat. He was the one who had slapped the counter earlier and had been loud and boisterous with the rest of the group. But now, his tone was different. There was a shift in his posture, a certain wariness creeping into his movements. "You don't scare us, man," he said, his voice quieter now, but there was an edge to it. His hand moved to adjust his jacket, the subtle gesture reminding Jack of the knife earlier. The man wasn't making any sudden moves, but Jack wasn't taking any chances. Jack remained still, his posture unchanged. "I'm not here to scare anyone," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to make sure this stays peaceful. But if you want to turn it into something else," he trailed off, letting the words hang in the air. He didn't need to finish the sentence. His meaning was clear. The older biker's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack could see the internal struggle. The man was deciding whether to push further, to test Jack's resolve, or to back off. Jack had seen it before. The dangerous moment when someone's pride was on the line. It could go either way. But he wasn't about to make the first move. Not yet. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that stretched until it became almost unbearable. The sound of the diner's air conditioning humming in the background was the only noise that broke the stillness. Even the other bikers were waiting now, unsure of what to do next. The young man with the piercing was still watching Jack, but his cocky grin had faded. The older man was staring at Jack with suspicion, but even he was beginning to reconsider. It was a game of patience now. A game of who would crack first. Jack had the advantage. The bikers, despite their bluster, were starting to realize that Jack wasn't just an old man sitting in a diner. He was something more. And for the first time, they weren't sure who they were dealing with. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jack knew this wouldn't last much longer. Sooner or later, one of them would make a mistake. It was just a matter of time. The silence in the diner was suffocating, as if the whole room was frozen in time. The bikers stood still, their eyes wide, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Jack's hand was still locked around the wrist of the man with the skull tattoo, but now his grip was firm and controlled. It wasn't a move made out of anger. It was pure precision, a skill honed over years of training and experience. Jack's gaze didn't waver. His eyes were steady, but they held a warning, like the calm before a storm. The biker, whose face had gone pale, tried to pull his arm back, but Jack's hold was unyielding. He was trapped, and he knew it. "You should have stayed in your lane," Jack said, his voice soft, almost conversational. But there was a coldness in it that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone watching. The room felt smaller now, the once busy diner reduced to nothing more than the stifled sounds of heavy breathing. The bikers were frozen, still processing what had just happened. The tough guy with the skull tattoo who had been so certain of his own power just moments before now found himself completely at Jack's mercy. For a second, it looked like the whole world had stopped. The clattering of dishes and the hum of idle conversation were replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The bikers, usually the ones to command attention, were now the ones left speechless. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him to be the one who could flip the tables on them so effortlessly. Jack's grip didn't loosen. He held the man's wrist steady, and in that moment, the room seemed to understand something that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. Jack wasn't just an old man sitting quietly in a diner. He wasn't someone to be ignored or underestimated. His unassuming exterior was a mask, one that had successfully concealed the raw power and skill that lay beneath. The biker with the skull tattoo was still trying to break free, but his efforts were futile. Jack's experience was evident in every move. He wasn't just strong, he was precise, methodical. And he wasn't giving the biker a single inch. "Let him go," the scruffy man with the beard said, his voice sounding hesitant. He had been the loudest of the group earlier, but now there was a distinct change in his tone. He was starting to realize just how dangerous the situation had become. But Jack didn't listen to him. His attention was still focused on the man who had dared to lay a hand on him. His eyes, now cold and resolute, never left the skull-tattooed biker. "You wanted trouble," Jack continued, his voice still steady but carrying a weight that made the room feel like it was closing in. "You found it? But it's not me you should be worried about." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something more. The bikers, all now visibly nervous, exchanged glances. They had pushed too far. The respect they had once commanded, built on fear and intimidation, was slipping away in front of them. For a moment, Jack paused. He let the silence stretch, making sure every single person in the room could feel the tension hanging in the air. Then, with one swift motion, he released the biker's wrist, sending him stumbling backward. The man fell into the table behind him, knocking over the condiments and silverware. His face was a mixture of disbelief and pain. He scrambled to his feet, but Jack wasn't done. He stood tall, his presence filling the room with an undeniable authority. "Now, get out of my way," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time for games. The bikers, for the first time, realized that they were no longer in control. They were in the presence of someone who had seen and done things they couldn't even imagine. And Jack wasn't backing down. The larger biker, the one with the beard who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, but his movements were slow, calculated, as if he was trying to figure out how to approach this new reality. His bravado had evaporated. He had seen it in Jack's eyes, the calm, calculating gaze of someone who had been through far worse than they could ever throw at him. "What's it going to be?" Jack asked, his tone still steady, but now carrying a challenge. The question was more than just a simple inquiry, it was a test. A test of their resolve. The bearded biker took a step back, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually back down. His hands twitched, like he was unsure whether to fight or to walk away. It was clear he hadn't expected things to escalate this far, and now, he was weighing his options. The other bikers stood silent, each one feeling the weight of the situation, unsure whether they should take a stand or retreat. And then, as if the entire room was holding its breath, the bearded man spoke, his voice quieter now, laced with uncertainty. "This ain't over." But Jack was ready. He had already seen the cracks in their facade. The group wasn't as unified as they had appeared when they first walked in. They were no longer the confident, rowdy gang who had strutted into the diner like they owned the place. The respect they once commanded had been shattered, and they all knew it. "It is for you," Jack replied, his words final. "I'll let you walk out now, but remember this, you don't get to make trouble without consequences." The biker with the skull tattoo was still clutching his wrist, wincing in pain, but even he knew the game was up. He nodded quickly, as if to signal to the others that it was time to go. One by one, the bikers began to shuffle toward the door, their pride broken, their fear finally settling in. As they filed out of the diner, Jack's eyes followed them, making sure they didn't make any sudden moves. The last of them left without another word, and the door swung closed behind them with a soft chime. For a moment, the silence in the diner was overwhelming. Then, as if a collective sigh had been released, the tension broke. The patrons, who had been watching in stunned silence, slowly began to speak again. Conversations resumed, but now there was a different energy in the air. The respect for Jack was palpable. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had regained something that had been lost long ago: his dignity. And just like that, the quiet retired Navy SEAL had reminded everyone in that diner of something important: never judge a book by its cover. As the bikers disappeared into the distance, the diner slowly began to return to normal. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversations filled the room again, but there was an undercurrent of something different now: a sense of awe, respect, and a little bit of fear. No one spoke about what had just happened. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. Jack sat back down in his booth, his hand resting on the edge of the table as he stared into the empty coffee cup. His breathing was steady now, but there was something about the stillness that made it feel like the calm before a storm. He wasn't one to get wrapped up in the noise of the world, but even he could sense the tension that lingered in the air. The waitress, who had been watching from behind the counter with wide eyes, slowly approached Jack's table. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. You're okay?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. Jack glanced up at her, his expression softening just slightly. "I'm fine," he said simply. "Just another day." She nodded, though she didn't quite look convinced. She had seen a lot of things in her time working at this diner, but nothing like this. She'd seen fights, sure, but the way Jack had handled himself, it was something else. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was an unspoken power in the way he moved, the way he'd taken control of the situation without ever raising his voice. "You sure you don't want anything else? Maybe a fresh cup of coffee," she offered, trying to break the silence. Jack shook his head, his gaze drifting back to the window. "No, thank you. I'm good." The waitress didn't press the issue. She turned to walk away but stopped for a moment, looking back at him with a curious glance. "I've got to ask. What happened back there?" Jack didn't immediately answer. His fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table, his mind still processing the events that had unfolded just moments ago. It had been years since he'd found himself in a situation like that, a situation where he was forced to remind people that he wasn't someone to be messed with. But it wasn't the bikers he was thinking about now. It was the quiet, sharp pang of something deeper, the reminder that sometimes, even the past couldn't be fully outrun. "Let's just say they picked the wrong guy to mess with," Jack finally said, his voice low, almost to himself. He didn't need to explain any further. There were things that couldn't be put into words, things that ran deeper than any explanation could go. The waitress gave him a nod, still unsure of what exactly had happened, but recognizing that it wasn't a story she was going to get the full details of. She simply smiled, a little more hesitantly than before, and turned to walk back to the counter. Jack sat in silence for a few more moments, letting the hum of the diner wash over him. The world was still the same, but something had shifted. The bikers were gone, but their presence, everything they had brought into the room, lingered in the air. It was the quiet power of a man who had no need to prove himself anymore. Jack didn't need to boast about his past, about the things he had done. His actions spoke for themselves. As the door swung open again, Jack's gaze instinctively moved toward it. A family entered, this time 2 parents and their young children, looking for a simple meal. They didn't notice him, nor would they ever. They had no reason to. But Jack noticed them, all the same. He saw the young boy looking around the room with wide eyes, taking in the new faces. His mind flickered for just a moment, and Jack couldn't help but wonder what the boy would be like in a few years. Would he grow up brave and strong? Or would he, too, find himself caught in the grip of situations like the one he had just faced? A flicker of a smile crossed his lips, but it was brief. He quickly turned his attention back to the counter, where the waitress had gone to refill a coffee pot. It was a normal afternoon again, for the most part. But even as he sat there, Jack knew the truth. The peace he had found in his retirement wasn't permanent. It was just a pause, an interlude in a much larger story. And while he didn't seek out trouble, he knew it was never far away. Not for him. Not for anyone who had lived the kind of life he had. Trouble had a way of finding people when they least expected it, and when it did, you either rose to meet it, or you fell. And Jack Dawson? He wasn't the kind of man to fall. He was a man who had learned to survive. He had learned to control his impulses, to think before acting, but when it came down to it, when the moment came, he had learned how to stand his ground. And that, more than anything else, was something the world needed to understand. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street. The warm glow of the diner's neon sign flickered to life, and the low murmur of the evening crowd started to fill the space. Life went on. But in the back of Jack's mind, a thought lingered: how many more moments like this would he have? How many more times would he have to remind people of the power of his past? He didn't know. But he was ready. The diner fell back into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft clink of utensils and the quiet hum of a few whispered conversations. The bikers were gone. The chaos they'd stirred up had evaporated with their retreat. But the aftershocks of the confrontation lingered in the air. The patrons who had witnessed the scene were still processing what had just unfolded. They exchanged cautious glances, unsure of what they'd seen, but all of them knew one thing for certain: Jack Dawson was not someone to mess with. Jack, however, seemed completely unaffected. He sat back down in his booth, as if he'd simply finished his coffee and wasn't thinking twice about the spectacle that had just unfolded. His posture relaxed, and he took another slow sip from his mug, watching the last of the bikers shuffle out the door, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. Their pride had been crushed, and there was no coming back from it. The waitress, still standing behind the counter, watched Jack with a newfound respect. She had seen plenty of customers come and go in her years of serving food at the diner, but never had she seen someone handle a situation like this. It wasn't just that Jack had thrown the bikers out, it was the way he'd done it, with such calm authority, as if he'd known from the start how it would end. It was a power that didn't need to be flaunted, and that, in itself, was what made it so intimidating. Slowly, other patrons began to return to their meals, but there was an undercurrent of admiration in their eyes. Jack could feel it, even though no one said a word. They'd witnessed something rare. The kind of quiet strength that only came from experience. And though the room had gone back to normal, there was a shift in the energy, a subtle change in how people viewed the man in the corner booth. One of the older men, a regular at the diner, cleared his throat and stood up, as though shaking off the shock of the moment. He made his way to the counter, casting a quick glance at Jack before nodding to the waitress. "I'll have another cup of coffee," he muttered, though his voice wasn't quite as gruff as usual. There was a trace of something like respect in his tone. The waitress nodded, refilling his cup as she stole a quick glance at Jack. "You know, I never thought I'd see someone handle those guys like that," she said, her voice quieter now. "They can be real troublemakers around here." Jack didn't respond at first. He wasn't one to speak unnecessarily. But after a long moment, he looked up from his mug and met her gaze. "Sometimes, people forget who they're dealing with until it's too late," he said simply. "You just have to remind them." The waitress nodded slowly, but before she could say anything more, the door opened again, and a new group of customers entered. They were oblivious to what had just taken place, chatting and laughing as they took their seats. Life at the diner began to return to its usual rhythm, the noise and bustle of the midday crowd filling the space again. But as Jack watched the new customers settle in, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He'd handled the situation here, but there were always more people who would test him. And while he had nothing left to prove, he knew that some people would never stop testing him, pushing him to his limits. As the waitress returned to the counter, she stole another look at Jack. She knew better than to ask more questions now. She had seen what she needed to see. But there was still a lingering curiosity in her eyes. What kind of man was Jack Dawson, really? What was his past, and why had he chosen to settle in a small town like Cedar Ridge, so far from the life he must have once lived? Before she could ponder it any further, the sound of a motorcycle roaring outside snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned her head toward the window just in time to see one of the bikers from the earlier group still nursing his bruises staring through the glass at Jack. His eyes were narrowed in a mixture of defiance and grudging respect. But Jack didn't even flinch. He simply continued sipping his coffee, his expression unreadable. He knew that look. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. It was the look of someone who had learned a lesson the hard way, but had yet to fully accept it. The biker lingered outside for a moment, his fingers drumming against his handlebars. Then, with a final glance, he revved the engine and sped off into the distance, disappearing down the road as quickly as he'd appeared. The diner fell into another brief moment of quiet. The tension that had hung in the air after the confrontation was finally beginning to dissipate, and life in Cedar Ridge seemed to return to normal. People ate their meals, made small talk, and went about their day, but none of them would ever forget what they'd witnessed. And neither would Jack. As he sat there, finishing his coffee, he couldn't help but think of the bikers, their bravado, their arrogance. They had come into his world, expecting to push him around, but they'd underestimated who they were dealing with. That was the thing about people like Jack: no matter how much they tried to run from their past, it always had a way of catching up to them. And when it did, there was no denying it. Jack Dawson had lived a life full of lessons, and today, he had just taught one more. The incident at the diner would become one of those stories that would get passed around Cedar Ridge for years to come. People would whisper about it, and the locals would tell the story with more detail every time it was retold. Some would say that Jack had taken on a whole gang of bikers by himself. Others would joke that he was a man of few words but powerful actions. But for Jack, it wasn't about the attention. It was never about that. Jack Dawson had spent most of his life in the shadows, doing what needed to be done without the need for recognition. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, and he didn't want to be. In fact, he'd spent decades trying to put that part of himself behind him. He had left the noise and violence of the world he used to know, the chaos of his past, and moved to Cedar Ridge for one simple reason: peace. But sometimes, peace isn't something you can just sit back and wait for. Sometimes, you have to stand up for it, even if it's in a way that no one expects. For Jack, that moment at the diner wasn't a choice, it was just the right thing to do. He'd spent years living with the weight of his past, learning the hard lessons of life and survival. His time in the Navy SEALs had shaped him into someone who understood the cost of strength, the price of silence, and the importance of knowing when to walk away and when to take a stand. It was that quiet strength that had served him through the years, and it was what had saved him from being pulled back into the life he had left behind. He didn't need anyone to praise him or thank him. He didn't even need the respect of the people in the diner, though he had certainly earned it. For Jack, the only thing that mattered was that the lesson had been learned. Those bikers, arrogant and full of themselves, had come to Cedar Ridge thinking they could push people around, thinking they could intimidate anyone who didn't look like they belonged. But they had underestimated the one person they should never have messed with. And that's where the lesson lay. It wasn't about fighting or proving who was stronger or faster. It wasn't about making a scene or drawing attention to yourself. It was about knowing your own strength, knowing when to step in, and knowing when to walk away. Jack had made sure they understood that their actions had consequences, but he had done it without raising his voice, without losing his cool. He had shown them, not told them, that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. And for those who thought they could take advantage of the quiet ones, those who believed that silence meant weakness, they would learn the hard way that silence could be a weapon far more powerful than any shout. After the bikers left, Jack settled back into his booth, his meal long forgotten. The warmth of the diner was comforting, the low murmur of conversation around him a familiar background to his thoughts. He wasn't a man who sought confrontation, but he knew that sometimes, when life presents you with a challenge, you either face it or let it consume you. That's why Jack had stood up that day, not to prove anything, but to remind himself that he wasn't just a victim of his past. He wasn't a bystander in his own life. And he would never be the kind of person who let anyone walk all over him, no matter how small or quiet they thought he was. As the minutes passed and the people in the diner began to go about their business, Jack's mind drifted back to the road that had brought him here. He hadn't asked for the life he had, but he had learned how to make peace with it. The scars of his past, the memories of battles fought and lives lost, had shaped him into the man he was today. He had made peace with those memories, and he had made peace with himself. But peace wasn't something you could just wish for. It was something you had to fight for, sometimes even in the smallest of moments. And today, Jack had fought for that peace, not with fists, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you're capable of. He didn't need the bikers to apologize. He didn't need anyone to recognize his strength. What mattered most to him was that he had shown them that they could not push him around. He had reminded them that quiet strength could be just as powerful as any roar. And in doing so, he had done more than win a fight. He had restored a sense of balance, a reminder that respect was earned, not given. That lesson would stick with the bikers for a long time, but it would stick with Jack, too. Because sometimes, it's not the battles you fight that matter, it's the way you choose to fight them. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The chatter picked up again, the clinking of silverware was heard once more, and the patrons resumed their meals, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But there was an unspoken understanding in the air. Something had shifted. And Jack, though he was just another quiet man in the corner, had shown everyone that there was more to him than met the eye. As he finished his coffee and stood to leave, Jack cast a final glance around the room. There was a new respect in the eyes of the people there. They had seen what he was capable of, and though they might never truly know the full extent of his past, they understood now that Jack Dawson was not someone to be underestimated. He walked out of the diner with his head held high, the sun shining down on the sleepy town of Cedar Ridge. The world hadn't changed, but Jack had. And in that small moment, in that quiet corner of the world, he had reminded everyone that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't have to prove anything at all. Because, in the end, the quiet ones are the ones who often carry the most power. The ones who stand still when others are shouting, who speak softly but carry the weight of their experience and strength. And for those who think they can take advantage of them, they're the ones who will never see it coming.